The hammer met steel, sending sparks flying into the dim forge. I had built everything with these hands. My home, my family, my trade. Turns out, some things burn faster than iron. My name is Thomas Finley. I'm 52 years old, and I've spent most of my life standing over fire, shaping metal into something worth keeping. My father did the same before me, and his father before him. This forge, Finley Forge, has been in my family for 5 generations. In Ash Hollow, that still means something. People know my work. They trust my hands. Steel doesn't lie. People do. The day I found out, I was finishing up a custom gate for the mayor's estate. Thick iron bars, curled edges, solid, no wasted material. Ethan, my apprentice, was at the anvil, hammering out a set of hinges. He's a good kid, 24, eager to learn, listens more than he talks. I had just quenched a piece when Julia walked in. "Hey," she said, arms crossed, eyes flicking toward Ethan like she didn't want to talk in front of him. I wiped my hands on my apron, nodded. Something wrong. She hesitated. Working late again? I could hear the edge in her voice. Lately, everything had an edge. Same as always. She exhaled through her nose, the way she did when she was holding something back. "We never see each other anymore, Tom." That wasn't true. She just didn't like the times we did. I didn't say that, though. I just looked at her, waiting. She shook her head. "Forget it." Then she turned and walked out. Ethan kept hammering, but I saw the way his shoulders tensed. He heard it too. I picked up the gate piece, ran my fingers over the cooling iron. "You hear a damn thing just now?" He didn't stop working. "Nope." "Good." I let it go. For now. That night, I got home late. The house was quiet. Julia was in bed, turned away, pretending to sleep. I could tell by the way her breathing changed when I stepped in. The scent of her perfume lingered in the air. Except it wasn't hers. I stood there in the dark, looking at her back. My wife. The woman I'd built a life with. The mother of my son, who was off at college now. For years, we had built something solid, something worth keeping. And now? Now it smelled like someone else's cologne. I didn't wake her. Didn't shake her, demand answers. I just stood there, listening to the silence between us. The next morning, she was already up when I walked into the kitchen. She was pouring coffee, her back stiff. "There's eggs on the stove." I poured a cup for myself, sat down at the table. Long night. Her hand hesitated on the pot, just for a second. Then she set it down and turned to me, arms crossed. "What's that supposed to mean?" I took a sip. "Just asking." She scoffed, shaking her head. "You barely talked to me for weeks, and now you want to make conversation?" I set the mug down. "Who is he?" That shut her up. Just for a moment. She glanced at the doorway, like she wanted an escape. "Jesus, Tom." "Who?" Not a question. Her jaw tightened. Then, in that flat, pragmatic tone she always used when she wanted to act like nothing could touch her, she said, "Does it even matter?" I sat there, staring at her, feeling the weight of her words settle in. Not an apology. Not a lie. Just a simple, undeniable truth. She didn't care if I knew. She wasn't ashamed. I nodded, stood up, grabbed my keys. "Yeah," I said, heading for the door. "It does." I didn't slam it. Didn't break anything. Just walked out, drove straight to the Hollow Oak, where Charlie Grady was already behind the bar, wiping a glass with that same damn rag he'd probably been using since the Reagan administration. He looked up when I walked in. "Tom." I sat down at the bar. He poured a whiskey without asking. I stared at it for a second before picking it up. "She's cheating." He nodded like he already knew. "Yeah." I took a sip, let the burn settle. "How long?" "Few months, maybe more." I exhaled through my nose. "You could have told me." He shrugged. "Wouldn't have changed a thing." He wasn't wrong. I sat there for a while, rolling the glass between my fingers, watching the amber liquid catch the light. Charlie didn't say much else. Didn't need to. The bar was quiet, the air thick with the smell of old wood and beer. After a while, I set the glass down. "I'm not gonna lose." Charlie nodded. "Didn't figure you would." I stood up, left a 20 on the bar, and walked out. I had work to do. The air outside was cool, the kind of crisp early autumn that settled into Ash Hollow around this time of year. The sky was just starting to darken, the sun slipping behind the trees. I drove back to the forge, parking where I always did, but I didn't go inside right away. Instead, I leaned against the truck, arms crossed, staring at the building I'd spent my life working in. The place my father had worked in. His father before him. Everything I had built was right there, solid, lasting. Julia had always said the forge came first. She wasn't wrong. But I'd always figured she understood that the work wasn't just for me. It was for us. For our son. For the town. For something bigger than either of us. Guess she didn't see it that way anymore. Or maybe she never did. The door creaked open, and Ethan stepped out, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked at me, then at the truck, then back at me again. You all right? Yeah. I pushed off the truck. You lock up. Was about to. He hesitated. Something wrong. I looked at him, at the way he squared his shoulders like he was bracing for whatever came next. Good kid. No nonsense. Nothing that can't be fixed. He nodded, didn't ask more. That's why I liked him. The next morning, I got up before the sun, sat at the kitchen table with a cup of black coffee, and started planning. Not thinking. Not brooding. Planning. The way I saw it, I had two choices. I could let this thing eat me alive, or I could get ahead of it. Julia thought she was playing her own game, making her own rules. She didn't realize I wasn't interested in playing. I was interested in winning. First thing I did was call my lawyer. Matt Caldwell had been handling Finley Forge's paperwork for years. Good man, solid, straight shooter. He picked up on the second ring. Tom, what can I do for you? I need to restructure my business. Everything. New LLC, new accounts, everything under my name alone. How fast can you do it? A pause. That depends. Something I should know about. You'll see soon enough. He sighed. I'll get started today. Good. Next, I made some calls. The house, ours on paper, but really mine, needed some changes. The land, the assets, the accounts Julia thought she had a right to? Not anymore. By the time she figured out what was happening, it'd be too late. I got to the forge early, but Ethan was already there, stoking the fire. You're early, I said, stepping inside. You always say if you're on time, you're late. He grinned. Good. Let's get to work. The day passed like any other. Orders to fill, metal to shape, customers to talk to. But under it all, I was thinking, moving pieces into place. When I got home, Julia was in the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of wine. She looked at me like she was waiting for something. Maybe a fight. Maybe for me to finally ask questions she could spin her way out of. I set my keys down, grabbed a beer from the fridge. You talked to Mark today? Her fingers tightened on the glass. Jesus, Tom. What? Just a question. She took a slow sip, setting the glass down carefully. You planning on yelling? Throwing things? I cracked open the beer, took a drink. Nope. She waited. When I didn't say anything else, she huffed out a breath, shaking her head. You always do this. Just shut down. Pretend things don't bother you. I leaned against the counter, watching her. Oh, it bothers me. Just not in the way you think. She looked at me then, like she was trying to figure out what I meant. I didn't give her the satisfaction. I finished my beer, tossed the cap in the sink, and walked out. The next few days, things shifted. Quietly. Efficiently. Matt handled the paperwork, and by the end of the week, every dime was in accounts Julia had no access to. The house was secured. The business was under a new name. Everything she thought she had? Gone. It wasn't about revenge. It was about control. The real test came when she finally realized. It was late, almost midnight, when she walked into the forge. I was finishing up a set of iron brackets for a client, the rhythmic sound of my hammer on metal filling the space. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed, looking around like she barely recognized the place. We need to talk, she said. I set the hammer down, wiped my hands. About what? She stepped inside, her face tight. I got a call from the bank today. Said my name isn't on the accounts anymore. I nodded. That's right. Her nostrils flared. What the hell, Tom? I leaned against the workbench, arms crossed. You thought I was going to sit back, let you play house with some contractor while living off what I built? She opened her mouth, then closed it, jaw tight. We built this together. No. I pushed off the bench, stepping closer. I built this. You were along for the ride. She swallowed, but she didn't back down. You really think this changes anything? You think you win? I smiled, slow and deliberate. I already did. She stared at me, waiting for something, anger, regret, anything she could use. She found nothing. She turned on her heel, stormed out. I let her go. There was nothing left to say. The next few weeks passed like clockwork. Orders at the forge kept coming, and I kept working. Hammer, heat, quench, steady, reliable, predictable. The way things should be. The way they used to be before Julia decided to make a mess of it. But there was one thing about a forge, it burned away the weak parts, left only the strong. That's exactly what I was doing. Word got around town, as it always did in Ash Hollow. Folks knew something had shifted, even if I wasn't saying much. Julia still walked through the grocery store like she had nothing to be ashamed of, chin up, expression hard, like daring anyone to say something. Mark, though, he had the look of a man waiting for a hammer to drop. And he wasn't wrong. It happened at the Hollow Oak on a Friday night. The place was packed, same as always, filled with locals shaking off the week with cold beer and conversation. I was at the bar, my usual spot, nursing a whiskey. Charlie was wiping down the counter, slow and steady like he always did. That's when they walked in. Julia and Mark. Together. The bar quieted just a little, enough to notice. Nobody stared outright, but you could feel the shift, the weight of unspoken judgment settling over the place. Mark looked around, face tight, like he knew walking in was a mistake but didn't have the spine to turn back. Julia, on the other hand, acted like she didn't notice. Like she was above it. She spotted me at the bar, of course. Her eyes flicked to mine, waiting for a reaction. I gave her nothing. Just lifted my glass, took a slow sip, and turned back to Charlie. She walked over anyway, Mark trailing behind her like a kick dog. Tom, she said, arms crossed. I glanced at her, then at him. Julia. A beat passed. Mark. Mark shifted his weight. Tom. Charlie kept wiping the glass, watching without watching. Julia exhaled through her nose. You've been busy. I took another sip. Always am. You took everything, she said, voice low but sharp. Everything we built. I set the glass down, looked her in the eye. You keep saying, we, like you were the one working 16-hour days in a 100-degree forge. She didn't flinch, but I saw the flicker of something in her eyes. Frustration. Maybe regret. Or maybe just anger that she wasn't getting the reaction she wanted. Mark cleared his throat. Look, man, I don't want trouble. I turned to him, really looking at him for the first time. He had a strong build, hands rough enough to suggest he'd done a day's work in his life, but his eyes gave him away. They darted, restless, never settling. A man who wanted to be more than he was but never quite could. No trouble here, I said. Just conversation. Julia let out a bitter laugh. Right. Conversation. She shook her head. You know, I expected more from you. That makes one of us. For a second, just a second, her mask slipped. I saw the frustration, the way her jaw clenched. But she covered it up fast. Come on, Mark, she said, turning away. Mark hesitated, but when I didn't say anything else, he followed. The second they were out the door, the conversations in the bar started up again, like a dam breaking. A few guys at a corner table shook their heads, muttering to each other. A woman near the jukebox gave me a look that was half pity, half respect. Charlie set the glass down. Could have been worse. Could have been louder. He smirked, poured me another whiskey. She expected you to break. She never knew me as well as she thought. Charlie nodded. Seems that way. I finished my drink, set the glass down, and stood. Thanks for the drink. Anytime. I stepped outside, the night air cool against my skin. Across the lot, Julia and Mark were getting into his truck. She was talking fast, her hands moving sharp through the air, while he nodded along, looking less sure of himself by the second. I shook my head, climbed into my own truck, and started the engine. They weren't my problem anymore. Never really were. By the next morning, I nearly put the bar scene out of my mind. I had bigger things to focus on. A rush job had come in, a set of railings for the town's historical society, and I'd agreed to have them done by the end of the week. That meant long hours at the forge, but that was fine by me. Work had always been the best way to keep my head clear. Ethan was already at the shop when I pulled up, setting up the anvil with a fresh set of tongs. He looked up when I stepped out of the truck. Heard about last night, he said. I grabbed my apron off the hook. Not much to hear. He snorted. You could have knocked that guy out, and no one would have blamed you. Not worth the trouble. Ethan shook his head, adjusting his gloves. Man walks into your bar, with your wife, and you just let him? She's not my wife anymore. I grabbed a piece of raw iron from the stack, tossing it onto the forge. And he's not my problem. He nodded like he understood, but I could tell he didn't. Not really. That kind of lesson only comes with time. We got to work, the forge filling with the rhythm of hammer and steel, the sharp hiss of metal meeting water. Hours passed like that, the heat and focus smoothing everything else away. Around noon, Ethan wiped the sweat from his face and leaned against the workbench. You really don't care? I glanced up. About what? About her. About him. I set my hammer down, rolling out my shoulders. If I let every dumb decision someone else makes live in my head, I wouldn't have space for anything else. Ethan frowned, thinking it over. Guess that makes sense. I didn't say anything else. Just got back to work. That evening, as I was locking up, Matt Caldwell's truck pulled up outside the forge. He stepped out, adjusting his tie like he wasn't used to wearing one. Got your paperwork, he said, holding up a folder. I took it, flipping through. New business title, new financial structure, everything in place. Julia had nothing to stand on. You're all set, Matt said. She gets nothing, legally speaking. I nodded. Good. He hesitated. You sure you don't want to push for more? If we really wanted to, we could make sure she leaves town with less than nothing. I shut the folder. She did that to herself? Matt gave me a long look, then shrugged. All right. Just thought I'd ask. He climbed back into his truck, and I watched the taillights disappear down the road. The papers in my hand felt heavier than they should have. Not because I doubted anything, but because it meant something was ending. Something I'd built my life around. But endings weren't always a bad thing. Sometimes, they were just another part of the process. That night, I sat out back of the house with a beer in hand, listening to the crickets. The stars were out, clear and bright. I thought about my father, about the lessons he'd passed down, about strength, patience, knowing when to fight and when to let things play out on their own. He would have approved of how I handled things. Of that, I was sure. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain. I finished my beer, stood up, and headed inside. Tomorrow, the forge would be waiting, and so would the rest of my life. The morning started the way most did, before the sun, before the town stirred. The forge was quiet except for the sound of the fire coming to life, the steady breath of heat building. I moved through the motions like always, but there was something different about today. The weight had shifted. The last piece of the mess Julia made had settled, and now there was only one thing left to do: move forward. Ethan pulled in just as I was setting up the next piece, stepping out of his truck with his usual energy. He wiped the sleep from his eyes and grabbed his gloves. Any fallout yet? He asked, not looking at me as he started pulling out tools. I knew what he meant. Julia. Mark. The town. She's been trying, I said, setting a bar of iron into the heat. Heard she went to her folks. Ethan smirked. That go well for her? I pulled the metal out, hammering down slow, controlled strikes. Not how she expected. Julia's parents, old-fashioned to the bone, weren't the type to make excuses for bad decisions. She went to them looking for sympathy, for some kind of reassurance that I was the bad guy in all of this. Instead, they saw through it. Saw her for what she'd done. I wasn't there for the conversation, but I didn't need to be. Word got back to me soon enough. They told her she made her bed. Now she had to lie in it. Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. Gotta be rough. Burn every bridge and still expect a lifeboat. I didn't answer. Just kept hammering. By mid-afternoon, we had the first railing sections done. Ethan took a break, leaning against the workbench, drinking from a bottle of water. You ever think about hiring more guys? He asked, watching me work. Why? He shrugged. Things are picking up. Could be good. I set the hammer down, rolling out my shoulders. You worried about the workload? Hell no. He grinned. Just saying, you could expand. I thought about it. It wasn't a bad idea. Work was steady, demand was growing, and with the way things had shifted, I had more time to focus on the business. Before, I'd held back. Thought about Julia, about balance, about keeping things from getting too overwhelming. That concern was gone now. Maybe, I said finally. Ethan nodded, like he'd expected that answer. Good. Hate to see work go to waste. That night, I headed to the Hollow Oak, more out of habit than anything. The bar was steady but not packed, the usual faces in the usual spots. Charlie was behind the counter, cleaning a glass, because of course he was. He gave me a nod when I walked in. Whiskey? Yeah. He poured it, set the glass in front of me. I took a slow sip, letting the burn settle. She's leaving town, he said after a while. I didn't have to ask who. When? Soon. Guess there's nothing keeping her here anymore. I swirled the whiskey in the glass. That's so? Charlie smirked. Don't play dumb. You made sure of that. I took another drink, then set the glass down. She made her choices. Not my fault they didn't work out. Never said it was. Across the bar, a few men were talking, their voices just low enough to keep from carrying. But I caught the name anyway. Mark. Charlie caught it too. He's not taking it well, he said, glancing toward the group. I didn't answer. Didn't need to. I finished my drink, set some bills on the counter, and walked out. The air was cool, crisp, the first real sign of fall settling in. The town felt different now, like a weight had been lifted, like something that had been rotting in the foundation had finally been cut out. I climbed into my truck, started the engine, and drove home. By the time I pulled into the driveway, I already knew. This wasn't an ending. It was just another beginning. The days passed, and life kept moving, same as it always had. The forge stayed busy, the orders kept coming, and my hands stayed steady on the hammer. The way I saw it, nothing had really changed except now. There was no dead weight dragging behind me. Ethan showed up early one morning with 2 coffees in hand, handing one over without a word. I took it, nodding my thanks. He watched me for a second, then leaned against the workbench, arms crossed. "So Mark's gone," he said, casual but watching for my reaction. I took a sip of coffee, let the warmth settle. "That right?" "Yeah. Packed up yesterday. Guess losing work, losing face, and losing Julia all in the same month got to him. Not my problem. Never said it was." I turned back to the forge, setting a fresh piece of iron into the coals. Ethan smirked. "Gotta admit, though, it's satisfying." I didn't answer, just pulled the iron out, laying it flat on the anvil. Maybe it was. Maybe it wasn't. Either way, it didn't change what I had to do. Later that week, I drove into town for some supplies, stopping by the hardware store. As I walked in, I caught sight of a familiar face at the counter, Rebecca, the town's vet. She was talking to Bill, the owner, leaning one arm on the counter like she had all the time in the world. When she spotted me, she gave a quick nod. "Tom." "Rebecca." She looked me over, like she was checking for something. "Heard you've had an interesting couple of months." I grabbed a coil of wire from the shelf. "Something like that." She smirked. "And yet, here you are, still standing." I shrugged. Never had a reason not to. Bill handed her a bag, and she tucked it under her arm. "See you around, Finley?" I nodded, watching as she walked out, then turned back to the shelves. There was something about her, not the kind of softness Julia had when we first met, but something solid, dependable. As I loaded up the truck, I saw Julia's car parked down the street in front of the bank. She was standing outside, arms crossed, phone pressed to her ear. She looked tired, worn out. Not my concern anymore. I drove back to the forge and got to work. By the end of the day, my muscles ached the way they always did, the familiar kind of exhaustion that came from honest work. Ethan finished up his last piece, wiping sweat from his forehead. "You know," he said, glancing over, "the way I see it, everything worked out how it was supposed to." I set my hammer down. Yeah. You came out of this with everything you built still standing. She lost because she thought she could take what wasn't hers." I exhaled, stretching out my shoulders. "You got it all figured out, huh?" He grinned. "I learned from the best." I didn't answer, just grabbed my jacket and headed for the door. Outside, the sun was setting, the sky streaked with gold and orange. Another day done, another job waiting tomorrow. The forge was still burning, and that was all that mattered. The last of the autumn leaves had fallen, and the first bite of winter was settling in. The forge ran hotter these days, the heat rolling off the coals keeping the bite out of my bones. Orders had picked up, the town's trust in Finley forged stronger than ever. Maybe it was always that way, or maybe people just liked knowing that some things still held firm, no matter what. Either way, business was good, and I was still standing. That was enough. Ethan had gotten sharper, faster. The kid could read the work before I even said anything now. He was shaping up to be more than just an apprentice. One day, maybe more. He was finishing up a set of iron hinges when I leaned against the workbench, watching. "You figure you're ready to take on bigger work?" He wiped his hands, gave me a wary look. "Depends. Got a commission for a full set of gates. Heavy work, full design. Think you can handle it?" He grinned. "If I screw it up, you'll make me do it again anyway." I smirked. Damn right. Charlie had been right. Some things burned, but the forge still stood. So did I. I caught sight of Rebecca again a week later. This time, at the farmer's market, checking over a crate of fresh eggs like she was making life or death choices. She looked up when I walked past. "You gonna stand there or help me decide?" I raised an eyebrow. "Didn't take you for the indecisive type? Only when it comes to breakfast." I picked up a carton, glanced it over, and handed it to her. She studied me for a moment before taking it. "You free this weekend?" I thought about it. Work was steady, orders lined up, but nothing pressing. "Could be," I said. She nodded. "Good. Come by the clinic. I've got a fence that needs fixing." I smirked. "That your idea of a date?" She shrugged, tossing a bill to the vendor. "Figured I'd start slow." I nodded. "Fair enough." She walked off, leaving me standing there, the scent of fresh bread and pine hanging in the air. Julia was gone. Left town a few days back. No goodbye, no fanfare. Just packed up and left like she had somewhere better to be. She didn't. But that wasn't my concern anymore. Mark? Last I heard, he was barely scraping by in the next county over, working odd jobs, no steady work, no real place to land. He'd been looking for an easy way in, and all he got was a hard way out. That was the thing about trying to steal what you didn't earn. It never lasted. I drove back to the forge, parked the truck, and stepped out, letting the cold air settle into my skin for a second before heading inside. The place smelled like fire and metal, like work well done. I stood there for a moment, taking it in. This place, this life, it wasn't perfect. But it was mine. I grabbed my hammer, set another piece of iron into the coals, and got back to work.